Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and today is day 4 of official Aether Revolt previews, and again, much like days 1, 2, and 3, we have a lot of cards to look at, so I don't want to waste any time. Quickly before we get started though, if you check out the description below, you'll see some links to our Amazon affiliate store. Any purchases you make through the store, including Aether Revolt products, small percentage will come back to help support the channel. Also, you'll find a link down there to our Patreon page, another great way to support us and help us keep making these videos. Having said that, let's get into the cards for today. And we're going to start off with a card that was actually previously spoiled, but we're getting a new version of it today. And that's Paradox Engine. So around Christmas time, we got to see this as an invention, and I did a video at that time where I talked in depth about this card and my feelings on it. So if you'd like all the detail, check that video out. But for today, since we've already discussed it, I just wanted to make you aware that it has now been revealed in its Aether Revolt form, and there it is. All right, now the next 8 cards we're going to look at are cards from the Planeswalker decks specifically. So if you're not familiar with the product, basically what happens is there's 5 cards in each of these 2 decks that they put out that are actually standard legal cards, but they are not found in the regular Aether Revolt set. Now, we looked at the 2 Planeswalkers previously a few weeks back, and we do have a video on the channel where I discussed those. But today we're looking at the other 8 cards that are going to be specific to those 2 decks. So let's start with the 4 cards in the Ajani deck first. And one thing you're going to notice right off the bat is these cards are designed to really not make an impact or be very standard playable, quite honestly. So you're not going to see a lot of huge power here, but there's a couple interesting ones for Commander maybe. And the first one is Ajani's Aid. This costs a white, a green, and 2. It's an enchantment, and when this enters the battlefield, you may search your library and or graveyard for Ajani Valiant Protector. Reveal it, put it into your hand, and if you did search your library, then shuffle it. And then you can sacrifice the enchantment to prevent all combat damage a creature of your choice would deal this turn. Okay, so this is a very narrow card, obviously. It's just going to search up the one particular Ajani, the one that comes with the deck. And the reason for that, if you played with these decks before, you know that basically the main attraction here is the Planeswalker. If you're not playing with a Planeswalker on the board, the decks can feel a little bit dry. So this is a way for you to hopefully get your Planeswalker almost every game or thereabouts. And that's why this card exists. The sacrifice ability, I feel like could have been a little better. Like maybe that could have been a fog effect. I don't know, for what you're paying, especially 2 different colors. I don't feel like that would have been too much to ask. But prevent all combat damage a creature of your choice would deal, I guess, does make for some maybe interesting interactions in multiplayer. So maybe that's in some ways better for the card design. I don't know. But again, it's a very narrow card, not one that you're probably going to play a lot outside the pre-constructed deck. Ajani's Comrade. This costs a green and 1. It's an elf soldier with trample 2/2. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control an Ajani Planeswalker, put a +1/+1 counter on this. This one's a little more open because it does work with any Ajani Planeswalker. So this might be something I'd mess around with in Commander if I'm running an Ajani or 2 in my deck, right? Because it is only a 2-drop. It does have trample. It has potential for growth. And if I'm playing a deck like maybe the Breed Lethality deck, for example, that we saw for Commander 2016, there might be ways for me to get an advantage off of the +1/+1 counters that are on the board, or even move counters or do things like that. So I don't know. Definitely a card that I would at least want to try out in a certain type of Commander deck. Next is Inspiring Roar. This costs a white and 3. It's a sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. This one's not too exciting for me. Basically, I just think there's better ways to do this in Commander. A lot of better ways to do this type of thing. So it's not a card that you're going to play probably much outside the pre-constructed deck. And finally, we get a reprint. It's Tranquil Expanse. This was from Oath of the Gatewatch, and this is simply one of the comes into play tapped dual lands. All right, let's move on to Tezzeret's deck. We have Tezzeret's Betrayal. This costs a black, a blue, and 3. It's a sorcery. Destroy target creature. You may search your library and or graveyard for a card named Tezzeret, Master of Metal. Reveal it, put it into your hand, and if you did search your library, then you shuffle it. I like this a little bit better than the Ajani Tutor. Again, it's very narrow because you can only look for that particular Tezzeret, but at least it is also removal, so that's kind of nice, I guess. If you are playing with this Tezzeret in a deck, then this card's okay. It's a lot better than the Ajani one, in my opinion, anyway. Tezzeret Simulacrum. This one costs 3, artifact creature golem. It's a 2/3 and you can tap it. Target opponent loses 1 life. If you control a Tezzeret Planeswalker, that player loses 3 life instead. Okay, so again, it's a little bit narrow. You can't hit a creature with this, and also it is life loss and not damage, so that's going to make this card a lot more narrow than other cards. But at least it does combo with any Tezzeret, so you kind of have that going for you. So again, this is a card that I might mess around with in Commander if I'm running a Tezzeret in my deck. It could be interesting or kind of fun, but nothing too exciting here. Next, we have Pendulum of Patterns. This one costs 2. It's an artifact. When this enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. Pay 5, tap, and sacrifice it to draw a card. Ouch, this one's rough. So I'm sure it's in the deck because it's an artifact that only costs 2. It can sit on the board for a long time, and I'm sure there's an artifacts matters element going on there. But aside from that, there's just not a lot of good stuff I can say about this card. I mean, gaining 3 life is not really a big deal, and paying 5 and sacrificing it to replace itself is painful. So yeah, I don't really think anyone would play this outside of the deck. And finally, last card, another reprint. This is Submerged Boneyard. This one also comes from Oath of the Gatewatch as another one of the comes into play tapped lands. With this one, we'll give you, of course, blue and black. All right, let's move on to actual Aether Revolt cards now, and the power level gets a lot better, I promise. So we got Gifted Aetherborn, costs 2 black, Aetherborn Vampire, Death Touch, Lifelink, 2/3, and this is an uncommon, another really nice uncommon. I think that's the overall theme of Aether Revolt is, hey, we're bringing you some amazing uncommons, which is awesome, because I always feel like you just get more value when you get a lot of playables, especially if you're playing draft or sealed, right? And if those uncommons are strong cards, you can build yourself a pretty nice deck in those environments. But also, too, it's nice for constructed like standard because it means that values of cards will stay relatively low, even if they get played very heavily in the format. But aside from that, this card's pretty good. I like the fact that it's a 2/3, so it's strong enough to avoid shock. That's a good thing. The Death Touch and Lifelink is nice. We can see how powerful that combination can be in cards from the past, like Vampire Nighthawk. However, do remember that card had flying, so there is a big difference there. But having said that, this is a nice 2-drop. It costs 2 black, so it might be a little harder to cast on turn 2, especially in limited. But if you can pull it off, if you can swing it, like this is a great 2-drop. If you can attack in on turn 3, maybe even turn 4 with this, get across 4 points of damage, gain 4 life, that's an 8-point swing. That's relatively significant. And at that point forward, the Death Touch is out there on the battlefield. Your opponent's going to have to find a way to deal with it or trade a decent creature for it. And that can get awkward, as you know. So, yeah, I like this card a lot. I think it will see some standard play, maybe an aggressive deck at some point down the line. But definitely an awesome pick for limited for sure. Next, we have Efficient Construction. It costs a blue and 3. It's an enchantment. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. I will say this, it's interesting, but it's not Thopter Spy Network. I don't really think this is going to be able to cross over well into standard at the forecasting cost without any card draw or anything else going on here. I think it's cool in Commander, though, if you're trying to build a Thopter Commander themed deck, or in Limited, as long as you have the artifacts to back it up, this could be a decent pick in Limited for you. Maybe a Build Around Me card, perhaps, depending on what else we see in the set. But yeah, I don't know if the power level is quite there for standard. Metallic Rebuke. This one costs a blue and 2. It's an instant with Improvise. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. So this is interesting. It's kind of like Mana Leak, but it costs 1 more. However, it has Improvise. So here's my thought. A Mana Leak for a blue and 2 probably isn't super great. Probably not really standard playable. You'll have other options that are better. But a Mana Leak for 1 blue and tapping a couple artifacts could be really good in certain decks. So I do still think that we're going to see a control deck that is going to have an artifact theme to it at some point in standard. And if that's the case, this card will see standard play. If we have more of a just dedicated old-fashioned control deck without the artifacts, then there's maybe other options that you would see played in standard over this. But regardless, I think it has a good chance of making it into standard, and I do think it's another good limited card. You only play with so many instants and sorceries typically in your normal limited decks, but this one I'd be happy to run. Ravenous Intruder. This one costs a red and 1. It's a gremlin 1/2. Sacrifice an artifact, and this gets +2/+2 till end of turn. Maybe just one of my favorite cards for fun factor today. This card's got it all. It has the fact that it has a nice little callback to ATOG, which is a very old card. And if you ever played with ATOG, there was a time where ATOG was actually pretty strong. It saw constructed play back in the old days. In today's environment, I don't know if a card like this will quite get there as far as standard, just because it does take a lot of artifacts to kind of back this up and make it good. Now, granted, there are some interesting token decks and stuff like that, so I wouldn't count it out completely, but it does rely a little bit too heavily on board state, I think. Having said that, though, in limited, this could be a lot of fun. Again, as long as you have the artifacts to back it up, it can be a strong card. Definitely makes your opponents have to think very hard about combat and what you have on the table at the time. What I really like about this card, though, is the art is incredible. I love the fact that the gremlin's going to eat the Invention Soul Ring. That's awesome. And the flavor text is amazing, too. From a flavor perspective, this card is a home run. I really love it. And I love when they do like little art asset fun things in the cards where they do throwbacks to other cards. They used to do that in the old days of Magic. You don't see it as much today. So I was almost actually surprised when I first saw this card. I thought maybe it was like a mock-up. I'm like, yes, this can't be real. But it's legit, I guess. So that's actually awesome. So kudos to Wizards. I hope to see more of that in the future where they have callbacks to art from different cards. I think that's always fun. Alright, the next card comes to us from an Italian language spoiler. It's Heroic Intervention. It costs a green and 1. It's an instant. Permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible till end of turn. This is actually another strong kind of cheap green card. I like this because of its versatility. It deals with pinpoint removal. It deals with board sweeps, as long as it's not like a language style board sweep. It deals with situations where you're being attacked in by a lot of creatures and you need a good combat trick to defend yourself. In some ways, it can also be an offensive combat trick. If you're attacking in and your opponent's making some blocks, this can make their blocks really bad out of nowhere, basically. So this is doing a lot for 2 mana. I really like this card a lot. And I do think it could see some standard play, maybe in like a green mid-range deck or something like that, or just any green deck that's creature heavy that's trying to protect its creatures. You could play this maybe out of the sideboard more so than main deck. I even think this could come out of the sideboard in modern decks to protect a deck that's creature base is important to them, like maybe Infect or something like that. So I find it very intriguing. The other thing that's interesting about this card, and I'm going to go into conspiracy land for a second here, a lot of people have been speculating that just maybe Damnation would show up in Amonkhet or Hour of Devastation because it's the Nicol Bolas theme set, and the name of the one set, Hour of Devastation, it just kind of feels like Damnation would belong in a set like this with like the Egyptian gods and all that. I never believed that because I just felt like Damnation is just too powerful for today's Magic and what they are doing today. But you know what? With a card like this running around, that does dampen Damnation quite a bit. So I don't know. I'm not quite there yet on board to say that we're going to see it in standard or anything like that, but just something to think about, if nothing else. Hidden Herbalist. This costs a green and 1. It's a human druid 2/2 with Revolt. The Revolt trigger is when this enters the battlefield, you get 2 green mana added to your mana pool. Again, another very interesting uncommon. It's a 2/2. Yes, it's a little fragile, but it's not so much about the size of this creature as much as its ability to give you a little bit of extra mana at times to maybe throw another 2/2 out there, especially early game. This could be a card that sees play in an aggressive, maybe perhaps a Gruul aggressive deck build if one of those were to get there in standard, or else maybe even just a green mid-range deck. But if the standard meta can support either of those, I do think this could see standard play. If not, then maybe it's something that comes out a little bit later down the road. But the power level is definitely there, and also it's another nice limited card for sure. Like, I wouldn't mind playing this in limited pretty much any time. If you can get the Revolt trigger to work, nice little advantage here for you for sure. Next, we have another Italian language card. It's Dissident Thopterist. This costs a red, a blue, and 3. It's a human artificer with Improvise. And when this enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying. It's a 2/2. So, again, here's another card where you're not super interested in the size of the body, but more really what it does. And for 5 mana or perhaps less, you're getting 4/4 power toughness on the battlefield. 2/2 of that is artifact flying power toughness, which does matter quite a bit at times. So this is actually pretty decent. I really like this card a lot. And you know what? If I'm playing this in a token heavy deck with servo, Thopter tokens, what have you, good chance I might be playing this at some point for 2 mana. That's actually really good. 4 power toughness for 2 mana. Very economical. Again, because of that, I do think this can see some standard play out there in an Izzet deck. And again, another real good choice in limited. Renegade Wheelsmith, a white, a red, and 1. It's a dwarf pilot, 3/2, and whenever this becomes tapped, target creature can't block this turn. So this is another interesting uncommon. Does have 2 toughness, so it is a little fragile, could get shocked, but it does have an interesting ability that you can tap it to crew a vehicle, and then at that point, you can choose a creature that can't block, and if you're really running over your opponent at that point, that could be pretty devastating. So in some ways, maybe it is a win more, I don't know. I don't know if this would actually cross over into the vehicle deck the way it currently is. It's nice, but I don't know if it's necessary for that deck to have. I wouldn't mind testing it though. Like I could throw 1 or 2 in there and like to see how that plays. But quite honestly, I feel like the deck's pretty solid, maybe even without something like this. Still good for you though in limited. It's a nice sized creature, 3/2 for 3. And also typically a lot of limited decks will end up running 1 to 3 vehicles in them. So this is a nice way to crew those vehicles and get a little bit of extra value. Spire Patrol, a blue, a white, and 2. This is a 3/2 human soldier with flying. When this enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. This one I think is fine and limited. I don't really see it doing a whole lot beyond that, just because of the casting cost. I mean, 4 mana, 2 different colors for a 3/2. Yes, it has flying, but it is very, very fragile. If it had some sort of hexproof or something, that would be different. Yeah, the tempo play of tapping something down is pretty nice. I'm very happy to run this in limited, but probably not in constructed. Next, we have another Russian language spoiler. This one's Aether Spear Harvester, costs 3. It's a vehicle with flying. When this enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy. Pay an energy, and this gains lifelink till end of turn, and it's a crew 1 with a 3/5 power toughness. So, here's the thing with these vehicles. We've seen some really good ones. The problem is we have this amazing one out there with Smuggler's Copter, and every time we see a vehicle, we tend to compare it to that, right? Like, this vehicle is actually pretty awesome, but it's not Smuggler's Copter. So that's kind of the sad point of having a card like Smuggler's Copter in the format, is because it makes a lot of very playable vehicles and probably really fun vehicles just not quite get there. And I think this is going to fall into that category. Could this see a little fringe standard play, maybe as a one-of in a vehicles deck or something? Yeah, it probably could. What I like about this, though, is I like having this exist. It's a 5 toughness crew 1 vehicle that potentially could also have lifelink at times. So if at any time in its lifespan in standard, that red can kind of get its act back together and put together a really aggressive, strong burn deck or something like that, which probably is more and more possible as each set comes out. I mean, we saw some pretty good cards in this set to help along with that. Then it's nice that this exists, because this will be a good card to sideboard in those type of matchups. So it might not make a huge splash right now, but watch for it in the future. And in limited, I think it's a great choice in limited. Fantastic card to play with as one of your maybe 1, 2, or 3 vehicles. Next, we have a Korean language spoiler. It's Lifecrafter's Bestiary. It costs 3. It's an artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, scry 1. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you may pay green. If you do, draw a card. So, this is actually kind of interesting to me, because I feel like this should be, or maybe I just want this to be a cycle. I feel like there should be 1 for each color. And I don't think it is, because this is the first one we've really seen like this so far. And I feel like if it was a cycle, we would have seen something else by this point. But maybe in the future, they finish out this cycle. It's interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One, on the downside, a green deck probably doesn't want to be playing this on turn 3. They want to be playing another decent creature. Like, that's kind of what green decks typically do. But if you get this into play, I mean, being able to scry 1 every upkeep, and every time you cast a creature spell, if you pay an extra green, draw a card, those are actually some really nice abilities on this artifact. So, I don't know. I think it's strong enough that I would try to work this into a green deck, maybe a green mid-range deck or something like that, or even perhaps an aggro deck where I'm trying to get the extra card draw to just keep the momentum going into the mid to late game if I need to. I could see it having a place maybe there. At the same time, I hate to slow that type of deck down by doing nothing on turn 3 that's not aggressive anyway. So, yeah, it's interesting. I think this could see some standard play again at some point. Again, maybe in that mid-range deck at some point down the road. But also another very good card for Limited. I'd be happy to play this in Limited. Next we have Hope of Ghirapur. It costs 1. It's a legendary creature thopter. 1/1 flyer. Sacrifice this until your next turn. Target player who was dealt combat damage by Hope of Ghirapur this turn can't cast non-creature spells. This is interesting to me. I'll tell you this. I love the fact that it's a legendary Thopter. That's awesome. I'm glad we have a legendary Thopter. That's the most exciting thing about this card for me. I'm going to go to Magical Christmas Land for a second and say that someday there's a burn deck in Standard, and I board this in. I play this on turn 1. For some reason, they don't have a way to destroy it. I attack in on turn 2, and then I basically just shut them down for the entire game for the most part. Yes, it's kind of nice that a card like this exists. I see what it's trying to get at, but at the same time, like, let's face it, most burn decks are going to be able to take care of this thing even on turn 1 or turn 2. Even in Standard now, we have Shock, right? So I'm going to play this really into a minefield. I mean, this is going to be a lightning rod. If for some reason the opponent wouldn't be able to deal with it, then it does become pretty decent against certain decks. But again, that's the key. Certain decks that may or may not make it into the meta while this thing's in the meta. And then once you get into, say, even Commander or Modern, I think there's better ways to do stuff like this. So, I don't know. I don't really see where it fits exactly. I mean, I'm glad it exists as a possible stopgap to try out against certain archetypes in the future, but I'm glad it's a legendary Thopter. I guess I'll say that about it. All right. Here's a good one now. This maybe is one of the more powerful ones we've seen today. Treasure Keeper, costs 4, 3/3, artifact creature construct. When this dies, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land card with converted mana cost 3 or less. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Put all revealed cards not cast this way in the bottom of your library in a random order. So this card was spoiled by Magic Mike's last evening, and this is a good one. I mean, first off, a little bit reminiscent of Bloodbraid Elf. And yeah, there's some positives and negatives either way. Like, it doesn't have haste, but it is a 3/3, which is especially important nowadays with Shock. And when this dies, I mean, you get a free spell. I mean, there you go. Just the free spell is just such a big deal. It seems to be a sub-theme of this set. And this creature dying gives you that free spell. It does have to die, which is important to note. It can't be flickered or something like that. But if it dies, whether it's in combat or while you're playing Magic, or you sacrifice it as a sack outlet later when it's not doing a lot for you, then there you go. You get some bonus out of it. And it's still a good creature. I mean, paying for, especially for generic mana for 3/3, that's actually pretty good on its own, much less the fact that when this does die, you're going to get something else out of it. Great, great card. And notice it's an uncommon. I would have thought this is a rare if I didn't look at the mana symbol. Quite honestly, this feels like a rare to me. And yes, this will see standard play, probably in a few different types of decks. I think it is that good. And this will definitely be a high pick, probably a first pick a lot of the times in Limited. I think it's that strong. So very, very cool card here with this one. Next we have Universal Solvent. This costs 1, it's an artifact. Costs 7 to activate and tap, sacrifice, destroy target permanent. So this is more for Limited to help you take care of a pressing threat that you really don't have another answer to, perhaps even a Planeswalker in a draft or sealed environment. But other than that, of course, with the activation cost of 7, I think that's much too high for Standard. But yeah, at least it's an answer in Limited. It's kind of nice to have it around. It's probably something you're going to sideboard in more often than main deck, but it is a universal answer. Good to have those. Having said that, those are the cards for today. This set is shaping out to be actually really cool. I love the power level. I love the uncommons. I love the free spells. There's just a lot of interesting things happening here, and I feel like 2 months from now, we're either going to say this is one of the best sets we've seen in a long time, or we're going to say the set's powerful and broke everything. But one of the two, right? So I think it's really looking awesome, though. Having said all of that, tomorrow we'll be back with our full set review with all of the white cards in the set. We'll be looking at those, taking a closer look at each card and their interactions with each other. And we'll continue that throughout the week until we get through the whole set. So until then, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. And have a great day. Hey, thanks as always for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.